In Ethiopia, the best way to travel is either by air or by mule. About a year ago, I set out on a series of journeys that were to last for several months. I was going in search of some of the strange relics of Christianity that lie hidden in the heart of the northern mountains. Nearly 450 years previously, a party of Portuguese travellers had set out across Ethiopia, just as I was now, to meet the fabled Christian king of the East, known as the Preston John. The Portuguese had been surprised to find some of the Ethiopians worshipping in churches which seemed to them to be very ancient, and may even have dated back to the earliest days of Christianity in Ethiopia, only 300 years after the birth of Christ. Since that Portuguese expedition, many more churches have come to light, some of which contain remarkable works of art. And even in 1961, it seemed probable to me that there were yet others, far out in the mountains, that hadn't previously been seen by the outside world. An armed guard was provided by the governor to protect my party from robbers and outlaws who still lurk in the hills. And indeed there were occasions when my muleteers were genuinely frightened for our safety. After a week's hard travelling, we came to an area where my guides told me there were a number of churches. I found this hard to believe. Around us there seemed to be nothing but the wild mountains. Then, quite suddenly, in the middle of this wilderness, we came across two priests sitting by the path. They were, in fact, within yards of the entrance to a huge cave, inside which was this beautiful church. No one knows why this church, which is nearly 1,000 years old, was built inside the cave. It may have been to hide it from Muslim invaders. It may simply have been to protect it from the sun and the rain. Some distance away, we discovered another cave church, even older than the first. This was the church called Madani Alem, the Saviour of the world. I was very excited when I saw it, because I knew that it had never been photographed before. The air in this huge vaulted cave was fresh, cool, and dry, and conditions which had undoubtedly helped to keep the church in such an excellent state of preservation for over 1,000 years. When I came right up to the church, I was surprised how small it was. The roof of the nave was only about a foot above my head. The windows also interested me, some of which were carved in the form of a cross. When I looked inside, I saw that the interior of the dome was painted, and that parts of the elaborate raftered roof and all the walls were covered with rich frescoes. One of these showed Daniel imprisoned in his den by two rather quaint lions. I knew this was Daniel because his name is written in Ethiopian characters on the wall. Next door, there was a very odd painting to find in a Christian church. A hunting scene, showing a couple of rather apologetic-looking huntsmen. I lingered for some time in the cave, completely captivated by the quiet, ascetic atmosphere of the place. But then I had to move on. I was within a day's ride of the most famous group of churches in Ethiopia, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. Lalibela was once the capital of Ethiopia, and who knows, it may even have been the town where the Preston John held court. There are 11 churches in the village, and what makes them so famous is that they're all literally sculpted from the living rock. This one, the Church of St. George, was carved in the form of a cross. The impression I got when I looked down on it was that it had been lowered into a huge pit. To get to it, I was shown down a deep cutting that wound round the back, finally leading to the bottom of the pit itself. Everyone who has ever seen these churches, and not many have, has experienced the same emotions. It is almost unbelievable that they are part of the mountain, carved out both externally and internally to resemble in every detail buildings that have been constructed in the normal way. The The 11 churches are interconnected by a warren of alleyways and passageways cut through the rock. Some of them are as vast as cathedrals. The arches and pilasters on the facade have no function, but the windows open out from a sizable cavern hewn in the form of a normal church. About 30 or 40 feet above the ground, there is a rickety wooden bridge leading across a chasm to the main door. Services are held regularly, and priests and congregation have to cross this bridge to get into the church. The rock in Lalibela is a deep red volcanic tufa, and is in fact quite easy to carve. Many of the rock faces are pockmarked with small caves, where generations of priests have been buried. Sometimes the shrouds have rotted away. This is the Church of the Saviour of the World, the largest of the Lalibela group, and like the others, carved from the solid rock. It's over 100 feet long, 70 feet wide, and about 40 high. With its surrounding colonnade, it seemed rather reminiscent of a Greek temple. I stood with the chief priest of Lalibela, overlooking these buildings, and asked if I could go inside some of them. Though he was quite agreeable, many of the other priests were a bit reluctant. But eventually I was allowed to visit the Church of St. Mary. Beta Mariam, as the Ethiopians call it, is generally looked upon as the finest of all the rock churches, and I was particularly pleased when I got permission to see its interior. These churches had been created entirely by hand, by labourers using nothing more than small hand adzes. As I approached the main door, I noticed they'd carved a panel in relief above it. This shows St. George slaying the dragon, with some other saint riding behind him. I was asked to take my shoes off before going inside, in deference to local traditions. Here, more than ever, I was astonished by the skill and patience that had gone into these extraordinary buildings. Arches had been hewn out and carved in deep relief, and the walls were covered with paintings of saints and other Christian themes. Most of the figures were recognizable from European paintings, such as St. George. A priest pointed out the four evangelists, and the Virgin Mary in a familiar pose. But I couldn't remember having seen some of the saints anywhere else. St. Theodore, for instance, or St. Taclahymenot, who had been canonized by the Ethiopian Church. When I finally came out into the daylight again, I found a service had started in the church courtyard. It looked an odd sort of service to me, with the priests dancing to the rhythm of a musical rattle called a sistrum, and singing weird, discordant hymns. But by then I realized that the ritual of the Ethiopian Church is very different to our own. When I left Lalibela, my next search was for something completely different, but equally strange in these wild and remote surroundings. I headed many miles to the north, to a place called Gundagundi, a desolate sanctuary deep down in a canyon, known locally as the Valley of Hell. been advised to take donkeys as pack animals rather than mules, as they were said to be more sure-footed. But at the last ridge before the final descent into the valley, I could see that the path grew steeper and more rugged, and I wondered whether even the donkeys would be able to cope with the loads without slipping and hurting themselves. We came within sight of the monastery of Gundagundi, and though it lay only a few hundred feet below, this last part of the journey grew really rough. Finally, we were forced to unload the donkeys, and the guards had to carry the baggage the last part of the way. It seemed that at some time in the remote past, the jagged landscape had been carved out in some cataclysmic upheaval of the Earth's crust. It was a terrible path. At last we were almost on top of the monastery, where I had a hunch I would find what I was after, so long as the priests were cooperative. But before that, I had a surprise in store. The Valley of Hell turned out to be more of a lush green paradise than anything else. White flowers grew along the banks of the stream. There were plantations of bananas, coffee bushes with heavy crops of beans, and scented orange groves. We saw nobody about except one little boy. We followed him up to the monastery. It looked to me to be an extensive group of buildings, and later I was told there were more than 60 monks living there. What strange instrument this monk was playing, it was difficult to see. But when I came closer, I found it was no more than 3 stones hanging on lengths of cord. It turned out that these were the monastery's church bells. The monks were delighted to see us, and straight away invited my party to the refectory for a meal. First, I was given a glass of sour milk, a popular drink in Ethiopia. It was brought to me by one of the novices, a small boy training to be a monk. Then another novice appeared, carrying a mysterious basket. Inside this was a pile of thin sheets of the traditional Ethiopian bread, which is called injera. To this was added a dish of curry-like mixture called wat. Wat and injera go together like bread and cheese. I found the injera by itself rather revolting. It was sour and soggy, and looked a bit like crepe rubber. But with the sharp-flavoured wat wrapped up inside it, it was excellent, and with the interpreter's help, I made a pretty good hole in the meal. I was doing the right thing according to the local customs when, having had enough, I sent the basket over to the guards. When they started eating, I was astonished to see two of them feeding each other. It seemed as though they were feeling the pangs of hunger in each other's stomachs. But apparently this is quite a common thing amongst Ethiopians, especially when they have reason to feel content with life. After the meal, we went down to the church, where the monks, first of all, said a short prayer on the steps of the sanctuary. Then I put the $64,000 question and asked them if they would let me see the valuable and rare manuscripts that I knew were kept in this monastery, and which I had come all this way to see. And to my relief, the chief priest agreed. But first he took me to see how these manuscripts were written in the past. In a courtyard behind the church, we found one of the monks squatting on a stool with a blank sheet of vellum on his knees. Their writing developed originally from a southern Arabian script. It is very ancient and is like no other writing in use today. These characters aren't letters, for technically the Ethiopians don't have an alphabet. They use what is called a syllabary, each character representing a different sound. He works with a pen made from a sharpened reed, and the inks, one red for the capitals and one black, are made from ground earth. Then at last the chief priest gave the order for some of the ancient manuscripts to be brought out into the courtyard, and as the pages were turned, I was delighted by what I found. The writing we had just seen was in Amharinia, the modern Ethiopian language, but these books were all in Ge'ez, the Ethiopian equivalent of Latin, which is only now in use in the church. Most of these books were very well illustrated, as I'd hoped they would be. Some pictures were self-explanatory. I could see, for instance, that this was the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, with the archangels Michael and Gabriel on either side. The coloring was brilliant, strong primary colors that gave the paintings tremendous life. Few of these particular manuscripts were more than 400 or 500 years old, but they seemed quite on a par, so far as the quality was concerned, with many European manuscripts of the same period. In fact, in many respects, they were very similar. Almost all the manuscripts one finds in Ethiopia are on religious subjects, either translations of the Gospels or stories about the lives of the saints. As we turned the pages, different stories from the Bible appeared. This elaborate double page depicts Christ's entry into Jerusalem on an ass, through crowds of followers with palms ready to lay down in his path. This gateway has written over it, "The Country of Jerusalem." These are the prophets. Isaiah on the right, Jeremiah next to him, and Ezekiel, Daniel, and the last person is simply referred to as a scribe. I was more than delighted after that exhausting journey down to Gundagundi that I had found what I had come in search of. When I left Gundagundi on a third journey, my goal was again rather different. Although Gundagundi was called the Valley of Hell, my next objective was definitely in the clouds. I was heading this time for the most ancient church in Ethiopia, and one that may well have been in continuous use for longer than any other church in Christendom. It was in a monastery perched on the top of an immense rock called Amba Debra Damo. The north of Ethiopia is well known for these extraordinary flat-topped mountains, some of which have played their part in the country's history. Owing to their vertical sides, which made them nearly inaccessible, they were once used as prisons for members of the royal family who threatened the security of the throne. I knew that Debradamo was so completely shut off from the outside world that it could only be reached by climbing up a rope. We'd first seen the hill when we were still some way away, and from a distance it didn't look as though it would present many problems. When we got closer, I began to think again. The huge cliffs towered above me, and I must admit, not being a natural commando, I was tempted to turn round and go home. This was the climb I was faced with. When finally we reached the foot of the cliff, a priest fastened the first of the baggage to a leather rope, and it was hauled aloft. When I looked up at it being pulled to the top, I felt decidedly queasy, for the point of no return seemed definitely now to have been reached. Then the members of my party started going up. He didn't seem to like it much either, though he must have been up frequently. I put my own ascent off as long as possible, but eventually I had to face it. Strangers are always tied into a safety harness, a fact for which I was grateful. In places near the top, the rock face began to slope gently outwards, and it was hard to get a footing. It was at this point that I became really a bit nervous. Whilst waiting below, a priest had warned me of this patch, adding encouragingly that several people had lost their grip here and fallen to their death. To me, the whole business was no joke. But the fellow who greeted me at the top seemed to find the struggles of a rubber-limbed foreigner immensely funny. Debradamo used to be one of the biggest monasteries in the country, with several hundred monks living up here. Therefore, I wasn't all that surprised to find practically the whole plateau covered with buildings. Curiously, though, there seemed to be very few people. I was told that most of the monks were down in the valleys below, working on the farms that belonged to the monastery, or running a small flour mill that the monks own in a nearby village. Almost as soon as I'd arrived, the priests began to show me around. On one corner of the plateau, I noticed a small church, perched precariously at the very edge of the cliff, with a sheer drop of 400 feet below. I wondered whether this could be the church I'd come to see, but I didn't remember having heard it was built so close to the edge of the precipice, and I felt it must be some other, smaller church. Eventually, one of the priests told me it was a church called Abuna Aragawin, or Archbishop Aragawin, named after the founder of the monastery. This old man, who lived 15 centuries ago, later became a figure of some envy to me. I was shown a manuscript that told the story of how once, whilst he was climbing up to the monastery, the devil had cut the rope. But the lucky old clergyman had been blessed with a set of wings that brought him safely to earth. Half a dozen bullocks are the only domestic animals on top. There are no cows because not even female animals are allowed in the precincts of the monastery. Water is another problem, there being no springs or streams. So all water has to be collected in catchment wells during the rainy season. There are nearly 200 of these wells altogether. Fortunately, there is a green weed that grows on the surface of the water, keeping it fresh throughout the year. Little novices cart the water to the houses in leather bags strung on poles. At last, the chief priest of Debradame took me to the ancient church that I'd come to see. The reverence in which they held the building became clear from his own behavior. Like all other Christian relics in Ethiopia, it is almost impossible to date them accurately. But this monastery was founded late in the 5th century, and it could have been that as I stood inside, looking at the carved wooden archway across the apse, I was seeing the original workmanship. Unfortunately, as in all other Ethiopian churches, the Ark of the Covenant, that is the central feature, just as the altar is in ours, was hidden from view by canopies strung across the nave. But in one part of the building, I was shown a magnificent ceiling made entirely of carved wooden panels, representing all kinds of animals, both real and mythical. These too were a mystery to me, for their character didn't seem to be Ethiopian. I felt this last journey to the mountain monastery that is most remote both in time and place, a fitting climax to my Ethiopian journey. This remoteness and inaccessibility hasn't changed since the Portuguese made their way across Ethiopia in search of the mysterious king of the Preston John.